Reading Herman Dory's Constantine and Religious Liberty. To begin with the most obvious, the Edict of Milan restored the property of the church, the places of religious assembly, and the cemeteries, and all the restrictions which had hitherto impeded the faith were removed. These provisions were derived from the principle that each should be given the freedom to choose his own religion, whether Christianity or some other. The basis for the freedom was that only so would the deity be favorable and gracious. To assure for the state the indispensable favor of heaven, it was the avowed intent of the new religious policy. The Edict of Milan, by seeking to maintain the cultic security of the state, remained within the ancient and traditional frame of religious thought. The favor of heaven with which the mightiest emperor could not dispense, and on which indeed his power rested, must be won and kept through correct worship. On this point the Edict of Milan is akin to that of Galerius, though in other respects the difference is great. Whereas Galerius conceded to the Christians only that what he could no longer withhold, the Edict of Milan accorded them positive favor. In the former decree the emperor looked only for supplementary help from the new cult, but in the latter the gift of freedom to the Christians was deemed the primary reason for the continuance of divine grace to the empire. They were no longer on the fringe but under the full light. There can be no question that the great event in which the divine favor had lately been manifest was the conquest of Rome. All contemporary historians were agreed as to that. One may therefore ask whether it was not the sign of the cross under which the victory was attained, which determined the Edict of Milan. One may also ask whether the voluntary dedication of the emperor to the worship of the Godhead does not go back to Constantine's own experience, which now was to be made available to all. These questions that confront us cannot be answered simply on the basis of the document itself, but the document assists our understanding where an important difference comes to light. If it be compared with the Edict of Galerius, which was extracted by an emergency, whereas Milan, the crisis having passed, rested not on compulsion, but on conviction. The edict is the more remarkable because it would have been natural for a ruler, after his conversion to Christianity, to shift all the previous relations. But whatever may lie between the lines of the edict, they themselves give no preference to either of two religions. One may be momentarily startled to find that the old cultus observed for centuries in the Roman Empire should be referred to casually as, quote, the religion of each man's choice, end quote. There is, however, no shadow cast on the old religion. In fact, instead of the term, quote, Godhead, end quote, used also by Christian theologians, we find a strictly pagan expression, quote, whatever divinity there be in heaven, end quote. This phrase may well have been inserted by Licinius, who was a devotee of the sun god, but throughout the edict the two cults are accorded the same right. Both the old and the new are to ensure the continuance of divine grace and enjoy unimpeded access to the Godhead. The empire rests upon both ways of worshiping God. It is an ellipse with two falsi. The edict does follow the need of both the inner and the outer situation. That is why it merits the attention given to it in history. A third word was spoken in this period of transition. It was not comparable to the other two, but it discloses another possibility that therefore serves to clarify the edicts of Milan and Galerius. It was contained in the edicts of Maximinus Daza, a nephew of Galerius, and the ruler of the southeastern portion of the empire. Up to this point, his name had been blackened by particularly savage persecutions, from which he desisted only when restrained by pressures from his superiors. First the Edict of Toleration of Galerius, and then the policy of Constantine and Licinius. The edicts issued under the name of Maximinus have only a suspicious a spacious independence. When acting for himself, he adhered to the principle that the welfare of the state depends upon the favor of the gods, whose worship therefore remains a necessity. And even when, under pressure, he disclaimed the forcible measures he had instigated, he nevertheless avowed very clearly that his intent had been to win back the apostates to the worship of the gods. The blame for the persecution was indeed shifted to the degree of Diocletian, which he had been obliged to obey, or to despotic judges, or to interference of subordinates. Maximinus even justified himself on the grounds that there were some cities which desired no Christians within their walls. How could he refuse this their wish? His own share in soliciting the wish was discreetly passed over. How little reliance could be placed upon his edicts of toleration appears from a bronze inscription preserved at Tyre. Here, as previously, the city was praised for the desire to be free of Christians. This pious disposition of the city and of the emperor was to be maintained for all time. From the inscription, one can see that the tolerance conceded under pressure would be abrogated at the first convenient occasion. It was a case of tactical retreat before a constellation of power, not a case of personal decision. Tolerance, through lack of principles, is also a possibility in a period of transition. What then happened after the battle of Chrysopolis, which made Constantine sole ruler of the empire? His war against Licinius was a holy war. The more both sides, in the preparation of the conflict, brought religious issues to the fore and sought each to enlist the aid of the army of heaven, the more the defeat of the pagan emperor must have appeared to be proof of the impotence of his gods. The battle won beneath the Christian ensign made Constantine sole emperor of the Roman world. Should he not then deprive the heathen of every right? Instead, there followed something totally unexpected. The conclusion the emperor drew from his victory was a renewal of tolerance. Quote, "Peace and quiet," end quote, he announced, quote, "should be enjoyed by those who err as much as by believers, for this would bring them to the true faith. No one should molest another. Each should live according to his own persuasion," end quote. Constantine had then proclaimed his principles in the form of a prayer. Quote, "Those who rightly believe should be assured that they alone live pure and holy lives, whom thou callest to fulfill thy commandments. But those who withdraw themselves may keep the temple of error. We have the house lighted by thy truth," end quote. This truth he felt was evident to all of right mind. Quote, "He who will not let himself be healed has only himself to blame, for the means of healing are manifest," end quote. But although the erring are without excuse, they are not to be constrained. Quote, "No one," end quote, the emperor continued, quote, "should harm another on account of his own persuasion. Whenever possible, what one has seen and known should be used for the benefit of the neighbor. But if that cannot be, let him go in peace," end quote. And then comes the climatic sentence, quote, "The battle for deathlessness requires willing recruits. Coercion is of no avail," end quote. These passages appear in an encyclical the victorious emperor addressed to the new provinces. It was his own faith that Constantine here confessed. But he was convinced that he was voicing only that which had been valid from the very beginning of the world. As to the true worship of God, to be sure it had been obscured and had to be brought again to life through the Son of God. Yet nature and the law of nature witness as much to its truth as did the events of this generation. Quote, "Therefore, O Lord, I have brought thee my soul in love and fear. I sincerely love thy name and fear thy power, which thou hast manifested in diverse ways, and by which thou hast confirmed my faith," end quote. Such faith laid upon him the duty of its realization. Constantine envisaged an emperor at peace and religiously united. To achieve it, he needed the help of the Christians. He would himself restore the holy house of God damaged during the persecution. One would suppose that this resolve would have led inevitably to the establishment of the Church as the only religion in the empire, and to the suppression of temple worship. But instead of such a decree, there came an edict of toleration. Its form is remarkable because it is couched as a prayer. Only to God is an explanation given, and this recognition of answerability to Him alone lifts the matter out of the realm of discussion. The personal conviction of the emperor voices an unequivocal judgment of disapproval on the ancient cultus. Without reservation, he says that there is no healing there, and the ancient shrines are but, quote, the temple of error, end quote. The heathen are the erring, and since they have withdrawn from the commands of God, they are also subject to moral condemnation. Not as in the Edict of Milan, the emperor now clearly declares himself to be a Christian, for, quote, we have the house lighted by thy truth, end quote. The heathen code is thus sharply rejected. If formerly the door to deity was open for the heathen, now it is closed. Not a kernel of truth remains. But however clearly truth and falsehood divide, the freedom of the erring is not to be restricted. They enjoy a full share in the benefit of peace, which now, at the end of the Civil War, accrued to all citizens of the empire. If they have lost their heavenly right, their earthly remains intact. Even their temples are not to be taken away from them. They may frequent them without molestation. The right of worship is freely assured. The rejection on the one hand and the freedom on the other are combined in a tolerance of persuasion, bidding all who err to enter the church. Constantine did not think of this coexistence of two different religions as something to last indefinitely. The ideal of the unity of all men in worship of the one God applied also to those who for the present abstained. Although the way could be trodden only voluntarily, the emperor hoped that those who till then had held aloof would soon join. To this end, participation in the blessings of the new era might be of help. The lesson of history, so evident to him, might speak also to others. This was itself one of the means of healing whose power the emperor declared to be, quote, manifest, end quote. It was at this point that Constantine turned to the Christians, from those whose cause had been vindicated. He expected something. As he exhorted them to prove their faith by their life, so he laid upon them a task that reached beyond their circle. Quote, what one has seen and known should be used for the benefit of the neighbor, end quote. But while he attributed missionary power to the Christian witness, he sought at the same time to protect the heathen from any assault. There were limits. The roles were not to be reversed, and the Christians were not to do what had been done to them. Quote, no one should use that of which he had come to be persuaded to another's hurt, end quote. The proposition that, quote, each should live according to his own persuasion, end quote, excludes any sort of injury, let alone force to be applied to non-believers. If one could not persuade another, let him go his way. This course was dictated not only by the requirements of the public peace, but also by the very nature of faith itself. The words addressed to the Christians and to the heathen correspond to each other. Neither were irreconcilable promises made to each other, nor were the questions as to coexistence evaded. The freedom promised the heathen for the exercise of their religion corresponded to the heightened duty of tolerance laid upon the Christians. The imperial judgment that the heathen were in error corresponded to the injunction to the Christians to testify to their faith. Because Constantine ascribed compelling power to the peaceful means, there could be no permanent lines drawn between Christians and heathens. Quote, the battle for deathlessness requires willing recruits. Coercion is of no avail, end quote. This is his own formulation of the Christian teaching that faith cannot be compelled. The statement uttered by Tertullian on behalf of the persecuted to the government that denied them tolerance stressed the point that force can secure only outward compliance, not inner persuasion. Constantine's statement belongs in another context. He was asserting the ground for his counsel to let the unpersuaded neighbor go in peace. He would forestall any infraction of the conquered faith by the conquering, just as he enjoined moderation upon the state. His word was directed to those who should exercise tolerance, rather than those who demanded it. It is, quote, the battle for deathlessness, end quote, that demands freedom. The more remarkable because Constantine's religion was so this worldly, yet at the point where faith enters upon a kingdom beyond the sword of the state, the very notion of coercing faith becomes unthinkable. Everyone must consent here to freedom. He did not need to inquire as to the quality of faith by which Constantine was impelled, or why he spoke of the, quote, battle for deathlessness, end quote. Enough that this expression suited him and his position. This was the firm basis of his toleration of the heathen. Such a policy, following directly on the decisive defeat of the heathen emperor, was not in accord neither with the prevailing trend nor the religious and political expectations of the time. This was Constantine's own word, and was contrary even to the wishes of the Christians. They too had read the lessons of history and interpreted them in no other way than did their emperor. God himself, through his servant, the emperor, had overthrown the powers of darkness and saved the world from corruption. Could one fail to see the obvious deduction to be drawn from this event? Would not one be inviting a repetition of the disaster if one should allow the temples of the ancient gods to remain open? Constantine took upon this objection in the conclusion to his address. Quote, I hear, end quote, he said, quote, some are saying that the power of darkness and the worship in the temples have been broken, end quote. He too wished that this worship might cease, and that the heathen would acknowledge the truth. No more, as in the Edict of Milan, did he expect anything from the old cultus for the benefit of the empire. Like the Christians, he saw in it rather a menace. His counsel must therefore be to abstain from it, but the wish to close the temples he would not endorse. Quote, I would recommend it, end quote. He said he, quote, were not the corrupted and refractory error prejudicial to universal salvation so deeply ingrained in some souls, end quote. In this statement, with which he repulsed the petition addressed to him, he turned from the cultus to the man who observed it. The faith of all men sets the boundary to force. The voluntariness of faith, which the Edict of Milan had recognized in favor of the Christians, must now be brought by the emperor to their own attention. Called the battle for deathlessness requires willing recruits. Coercion is of no avail, end quote. Constantine acted in accord with these words. Worship in the temples continued, and the heathen were not pushed aside. Now, as before, he admitted them to the highest offices. Officials no longer had to sacrifice, and the imperial cult was of course discontinued, but it was not replaced by obligatory Christian rites, which the heathen could not render. From the Christian viewpoint, public officials had no priestly function. Precisely the separation of the priestly and the political enabled the heathen to retain a political role. What a profound change the separation was to exercise. The following centuries were to show, at their close, the secularized state emerged. The conclusion of the emperor's message pointed to the fact that many were still enmeshed in heathenism. The majority of the population, in fact, political sagacity alone therefore precluded interference with the religious practices of the heathen subject. But the reason the emperor adduced his appeal to God was different. Quote, faith itself admits of no constraint, end quote. This principle permitted Constantine to do what the situation required. Just as the Christian separation of function enabled the heathen to remain in office, so also the command of faith gave the emperor freedom to retain them. Such a weighty word as the statement, quote, the battle for deathlessness requires willing recruits, end quote, does not say very much unless it grows out of the experience of him by whom it is spoken. Constantine's proclamation of tolerance rested in his own history. Freedom to go his own way was exactly what he had exercised. His course had begun with silent disapproval of the Christian persecutions on which Diocletian resolved at the end of his reign. The young prince Constantine, reared as a hostage at the court of the old emperor, whose policy he was, in many respects, later to continue and fulfill, at this point rejected the coercive religious programs of his teacher, since it robbed the empire of useful members and loosed savagery against worthy men. Here one sees the sure and independent judgment of the incipient statesman, as well as his moral indignation against injustice. Still, at the time, he was not moved by any approach to the faith of the persecuted. As a soldier, he admired the steadfastness of the martyrs and sensed in them a sustaining power. The consequences of the disastrous policy of the empire were not slow in following. To Constantine, as to others, that the ill fortunate and decline of the persecutors appeared as a divine judgment. The return of Constantine to his father in Britain and succession to him in the government carried with it exclusion of Christian persecution from his portion of the empire. The first years of his administration provided an opportunity to act in accord with his early aversion to constraint. On his part, this was a period of seeking, during which he still adhered to the cult of the sun god. Constantine's final decision included an insight into the moral order of the universe, which he interpreted as a conversion and a daring resolve to throw himself into the battle for Rome under the Christian ensign. This purely personal decision had no prototype. Here was an act of independence over against the past which clave the unity of the Roman Empire and the Roman religion. No less independent was the manner in which he grasped the Christian faith. He did not attach himself to a group of people in whose institutional structure and dynamism his clairvoyant eye perceived a future political asset. Rather, he committed himself to the God worshipped by the Christians, and even while they held aloof from the politics, he expected help from their God for political ends. The new way upon which he had entered, and which took its course through the victory at Rome and the sole rulership of the emperor, seemed to him to have begun and ended under divine leadership. Just as he had gone over an untrodden course and perceived the powerlessness of external compulsion, so also he would give to his subjects the freedom of personal decision. An incisive law does not, as such, invest an hour of history with supreme historical rank, nor does an event which is not understood, however far-reaching its consequences, but when the word and the deed come together, and the great event is grasped in a great manner, then one can speak of stature in history. Constantine, after the victory in Chrysopolis, which brought unity to the empire, turned to the eastern provinces in order to explain to them the meaning of this hour. A review of recent history served as an aid to comprehension. He could point out that the persecution of Diocletian, contrary as it was to law and to God, had brought disaster to the state, and the task of restoration God himself had given to the emperor. With such authority and under the Christian ensign, Constantine had then not only defeated the disturbers of the peace, but had cast down the demonic power sustaining them. The great dragon of the abyss. The reference here is obviously to the great events which had been the experience of all. His subjects should not be blind to that which lay evident to all. The demand of the hour, whose herald he was, had to be fulfilled with all the powers of soul and mind. The personal confession of the emperor should be appropriated by his subjects and made their own, because his history was their history also. The hour called for more than conservation of the past. They also had to look to the future into which the emperor was leading them, but where they could follow only through their own decision. This view of history, the confession, and the appeal all prove the seriousness of his proclamation of freedom. They would have had no point if mere command and blind obedience could have sufficed. The intelligent cooperation necessary for the achievement of the emperor's goal acquired freedom of faith. Here it is that the history of the emperor is conjoined with universal history. Here it is that the widest dimension was achieved from the world below to the world above. Political history was understood as religious history. There is here an understanding of history derived from faith and issuing in faith. This in itself calls for freedom. To assess the significance of Constantine's stand, we must scan a vast expanse, from a height sufficient to enable us to take in its totality. Let us bring before ourselves what is entailed. The peculiar quality lay not in the new form contributed to the Roman Empire, for at this point Diocletian had already made the beginning which Constantine merely brought to completion. Rather, the newness lay and that something believed impossible had come to pass, that the emperor had become a Christian, that the church and the empire had found each other, that in this moment the history of their union, through more than 16 centuries, had its beginning. This is why the Constantinian era was epoch-making. With a single stroke, that which hitherto had exercised rulership had been dethroned. That which had been built for eternity collapsed overnight. That which formerly had been deemed holy was branded as unholy, and the despised came to be honored. And the despised came to be honored. There was no height. This change did not scale. And no depth did it not plumb. And in this moment, when the victory of Constantine over Licinius demolished the last rampant of antiquity, and a new period definitely began, precisely at this moment there was a check. Tolerance seemed to impede the new and rescue the old from eradication, but the preservation of the old was not due to the old, as if the conquered could lay down the law to the conqueror, but rather sprang from the nature of the new, and it is to be understood only on this basis. This tolerance legislated for the actual situation, but it was not a political word, as if the statesman simply bowed to necessity, nor was it derived from the principles laying readily at hand. It was precisely to the Christians that the emperor had to address his explanation. He had responded to the demand of faith, which left him free to deal with the situation as the case required. His proclamation was at once his own word, and yet not his own contrivance. It fashioned the hour and gave to it its stature in history. It lifted the hour above the flow of events, gave to the old its due, and could claim to be acknowledged as fruition by the new. The most indisputable proof of the genuineness of Constantine's tolerance is that the treatment of worship in the army, this was still considered to be as important for the security of the state as in the days of the heathen emperors. Diocletian and Galerius removed the Christians from the army because their very presence imperiled the sacrifices and deprived them of their efficacy. For the same reason, later, Theodosius II allowed only Christians to serve in the army, because, even by their presence, would alienate heavenly assistance. The regulation of worship in the army lay with the emperor. Now was the time to see whether Constantine would hold true to his principle. When it was a question of keeping or of losing power, since everything depended on assuring the help of him who determines the outcome of battles, a solution was not easy to find, because the heathen cult no longer had any access to heaven. Yet no one should be forced to take part in Christian worship. The emperor sought a middle course. On Sundays, when the Christian soldiers were occupied with their services, the pagans were assembled on an open field and were summoned to engage in a common prayer. Constantine himself composed the text, quote, "We know that thou alone art God. We acknowledge thee as King. We lift our hands to thee as our helper. Thine outstretched arm hath given us the victory. Through thee we were stronger than our enemy. We thank thee for thy help vouchsafed in time past, and beseech it for the future. Grant for our sakes unto our Emperor Constantine and his beloved sons length of days and health and victory." End quote. Only a monotheistic prayer Constantine was sure of that would be well received, and since the heathen recognized the supreme deity, the emperor assumed that non-Christians would not take umbrage if he placed in pagan mouths a prayer to the emperor in heaven. They should pray to him as their helper in battle and ask of him victory, as Constantine himself had done in a critical hour with such evident success. Through such a prayer they would at the same time reinforce the power of the earthly emperor and assure the continuance of his house. This was an astonishing solution which must be evaluated in the light of the views of the period. It shows that the emperor had in no sense relinquished his judgment as to the uselessness of the heathen cultus, and at the same time that he was not false to his conviction that true faith cannot be forced. He allowed the Christians to attend their own worship and did not require that they take part in a neutral and syncretic age celebration. But neither did he compel the heathen to enter the church. They must take part in religious worship serviceable to the state, but need not compromise their own conscience. Judged in terms of the period and its assumptions, Constantine's prayer for the army is a proof of the genuineness of his tolerance. A backward look now at the Edict of Milan will enable us to perceive the special quality of Constantine's Edict of Toleration, that which Milan adumbrated here becomes clear, namely the emperor's personal Christian confession on the basis of which he addresses all and summons all to follow his way. This determines his judgment that the Christians are right and that the heathen are in error. The heathen temples are temples of falsehood. The powers of darkness reign therein. In this document he leaves the heathen no access to heaven as he had done at Milan. For whereas then he assumed that the practices of their cultus could be a benefit to the empire, now he thinks that it is rather a peril. But alongside the sharp rejection stands an unrestricted freedom. The heathen are not forbidden to frequent the temples. At the same time, and as this was a point that Milan did not envisage, Christian and heathen are brought into relation with each other. Christians are enjoined to address themselves to the heathen in order to benefit them by their knowledge and experience. But if the heathen reject the message, they are to be permitted to go their own way, just as the emperor himself addresses them in terms of his own experience. An insight in when they close their ears exercises no constraint. The duty to speak and command, to be silent and leave alone, affects alike the emperor and the Christians whom he addresses. They have a part in his tolerance, and he in their witness. He is not a third party above two religions. He belongs to the one over against the other, with responsibility both as an emperor and as a Christian. This was a provisional regulation, looking to a not far distant future, in which it would be superfluous. But this very provisional character contained the warrant of continuance, because the hope by which it was limited proved deceptive. In contrast with the Edict of Milan, the transitional quality of the latter edict becomes evident, cast in a form without specific limitation, and so apparently valid forever. It became obsolete with the passing of the epoch in terms of which it was conceived and to which it was addressed. Constantine's law for the pagan, however, because not bound to the moment to which it was directed, acquired its place in history. But in changing the second focal point of Milan into an exclusive center, did not the Edict of 324 really return to that of Galerius, except that now the Christian church took the place of the pagan temple? The tolerance which Galerius had extended to the Christians was now bestowed upon the pagans, but both thought in terms of a circle not like Milan and an ellipse. Of course, Galerius' concession had been made under the pressure of the state's emergency, and expected in return that Christian intercession would procure additional heavenly help for the empire. By contrast, Constantine's toleration took place at the height of its power, and sought no gain from the temple's adherents. The Edict of Milan, like that of Galerius, put its hope in both religions, but it was distinguished from that of Galerius by the sure confidence placed in Christian worship. This represented an advance over Galerius in the history of toleration. On the other hand, the untroubled continuance of both cults from now on depended upon the continuance of imperial confidence in the rights of both. Should this confidence be shaken, tolerance would be endangered. This state of affairs, Licinius, one of the two signatories, soon made clear. He began to oppress the Christians. Constantine too lost confidence in the rights of one of the religions recognized by Milan, while he returned to the conviction that it is only one cult which bears up the empire. He remained tolerant, and even deepened his own understanding of toleration. It was his new understanding that guaranteed that to those who were tolerated a measure of safety which even Milan could not provide for them. So the idea of toleration advanced to a new stage. Appearing to return to Galerius, had nevertheless adopted the purpose of Milan, and so united both within himself, and transcended them both. Yes, and uniting transcended them both.